Try it if you can." The words hung in the dusty air of the barn, a dare wrapped in desperation. Sarah, a woman built like a mountain, leaned forward in the hay, her shadow swallowing the flickering lantern light. Her eyes, burning with a fire that had scorched every man who'd come before, locked onto the rancher frozen in front of her. He had a name: Jake. But in that moment, he was just another pair of boots about to turn and run. "This is too big for me," he whispered, and the confession was a crack in the dam of her hope. Every man said it. Every man ran from the sheer fact of her, the breadth of her shoulders, the length of her stride, the raw, untamed space she occupied in the world. They wanted a woman who could fit in the neat little box of their expectations. Sarah didn't own a box that small. "Every man runs when they see all of me," she growled, the sound low and dangerous. "So run, or try it. I dare you." He flinched, his gaze dropping to the straw-covered floor. It's too much." She leaned closer, the scent of hay and honest sweat clinging to her. Her voice dropped, losing its edge and gaining a weight that was heavier than any stone. "Then learn what it means to stay." The old barn groaned around them, the timbers settling as if they understood the gravity of her challenge. Outside, the prairie was a vast, black ocean under a sliver of moon. But inside, the air was thick, pulsing with a heat that had nothing to do with the summer night. It was the heat of a choice being forged. Jake felt like a man on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a canyon so deep it had no bottom. He was a man who wrestled horses into submission, who fought droughts until his hands bled, who faced down prairie storms that could peel a roof off a house like a tin can lid. None of it had ever made his hands shake like this. None of it had ever made his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. But Sarah wasn't a storm to be weathered. She was a truth to be faced. Her face, framed by wild strands of fire-red hair, held the dare, but underneath it, he saw a prayer. A silent plea for one man, just one, not to be a coward. He felt the crushing weight of her courage, her loneliness, her defiance, all pressing down on him. He wanted to look away, to break the spell, but he couldn't. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely a rasp. "It's not you I'm afraid of." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "It's me. What if I'm not enough?" Her jaw tightened, a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. "Not enough for who? For me?" The words were sharp. "I never asked for a perfect man, Jake. I asked for one who wouldn't run." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. His boots scuffed the straw, the small sound echoing in the sudden, tense silence. His throat was bone dry. He reached for a tin jug of water, splashing some into his palm and onto his face. The cold shock did nothing to douse the fire her words had lit in his gut. She leaned back against a bale of hay, her posture slumping just a little, the fight momentarily draining out of her. Her voice was softer now, laced with a weariness that went bone deep. "Every man who came before you, they wanted me to shrink, to fold myself up into smaller pieces so they wouldn't feel so threatened. But I don't bend anymore, Jake. I can't." She gestured toward the open barn doors, a sliver of moonlight spilling onto the floor like a silver knife. "If that's what you want, a woman you can fold up and put in your pocket, then go. Leave me here in the dark. I'm used to it." He thought of his own darkness, the long, silent winters on the ranch, the quiet that filled his small cabin like a suffocating smoke. He thought of the two lonely graves on the hill, his father and his brother, and the way loss had carved him into something lean and quiet and restless. He had spent his whole life surviving on this land, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd truly felt alive. And then he looked at Sarah, this magnificent, terrifying, beautiful woman, burning with a fire that no one else had ever been brave enough to stand near. He took a step closer. The straw crunched under his boot. "You're right," he said, his voice finding a new strength. "I don't want small. I don't want silence. I don't want safe." He paused, the confession tearing from his soul. "I just don't know if I have the strength to carry a love this big." For the first time that night, her eyes softened. A genuine, unguarded warmth spread across her face. "Then don't carry it," she whispered. "Share it." The lantern flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The barn smelled of earth and horses and the coming rain. In that small, fragile circle of light, it felt like the world had stopped spinning, holding its breath just for them. Jake lowered himself onto the hay beside her, moving with a carefulness he usually reserved for spooked foals. His hands, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of hard labor, rested on his knees. He stared at them for a long moment, then slowly, hesitantly, he lifted one toward her. "May I?" he asked, his voice thick. Her lips parted in surprise. She'd been met with brute force, with clumsy lust, with fear and with pity, but never with this, never with a gentle question. She gave the smallest of nods. His hand found hers. It was warm, steady and real. Her fingers closed around his, a desperate, grateful grip, like a drowning woman finding a raft. For a long moment, they just sat there, the silence between them no longer empty and awkward, but full of unspoken fears and fragile hopes. Then she whispered, so softly he almost didn't hear it. "Jake, don't make me beg to be chosen." He looked at her then, really looked. He saw the strength in her shoulders that had carried a lifetime of loneliness. He saw the deep, hidden sadness in her eyes. He saw how her defiance was a shield built over years and years of quiet heartbreak. "You don't have to beg," he said, his own voice shaking now, but his words were as solid as the ground beneath them. "Not tonight. Not ever." A small, hitched breath escaped her lips. For the first time, she looked away, blinking rapidly against the sudden sting of tears. She wasn't used to kindness. She wasn't used to being seen. He gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You think you're too big for me," he said, the truth of it dawning on him like a sunrise. "But Sarah, maybe I've been too small for you all along." The revelation landed between them, as loud and powerful as a crack of thunder. But before either of them could say another word, a new sound cut through the night, a sound that didn't belong, the crunch of hooves on the dirt road leading to his ranch. Jake stiffened, his hand still holding hers. Sarah heard it too, her whole body going rigid, like a bowstring pulled taut. It wasn't just one horse. It was two, moving slow and deliberate, heading straight for the barn. He was on his feet in an instant, his jaw set like granite. "Stay behind me." But Sarah rose too, her massive frame towering beside him, a sudden fierce protectiveness in her eyes. "I won't hide," she declared, her voice ringing with newfound resolve. The barn doors, which had been resting slightly ajar, groaned open wider. Two figures on horseback appeared, their forms dark silhouettes against the pale moonlight. One of them, a man in a fine city coat, dismounted with a practiced ease. The other, a burly man with a broad-brimmed hat pulled low, remained in his saddle, his hand resting casually on his hip, close to a holstered pistol. The man in the coat smiled, but the expression was cold, predatory. It didn't come close to touching his eyes. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "We're looking for a woman. Big girl. Hard to miss." His gaze slid over to Sarah, his eyes raking over her form with the detached appraisal of a man measuring cattle for market. "Goes by the name of Sarah. Belongs to a contract I carry right here in my pocket." Jake stepped forward, positioning his body squarely in the doorway, a human barrier. "There are no contracts here," he said, his voice low and even. "Only people." The man's smile thinned, becoming a cruel slash in the darkness. That's not what this paper says. Papers burn, Jake shot back. People don't. Sarah's heart was hammering against her ribs, but her voice, when she spoke, was as calm and cold as a winter morning. I don't belong to you. I never did. The second rider, the one still on his horse, shifted in his saddle and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. We can do this polite, he grunted, his voice like gravel. Or we can do it the way dust settles after a stampede. Your choice. Jake didn't move. He stood his ground, his hand brushing against the rough-hewn wood of the doorframe. He was as steady and unmovable as the ancient oaks on the ridge. Sarah stepped up beside him, their shoulders touching. Her shadow stretched out across the barn floor, swallowing the intruder's boots whole. For the first time in her life, she wasn't standing alone against the world. She was standing with someone. The man in the coat studied them for a long, silent moment, his cold smile finally fading, replaced by a look of irritated surprise. The night grew deathly quiet, the only sound the soft creak of saddle leather. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. This isn't over. We'll be back, and next time we'll bring the sheriff, and the man who paid for her. With that, the two men turned their horses. They kicked up a cloud of dust that hung in the moonlight like a ghostly shroud. Then they disappeared back into the darkness from which they came. Jake let out a long, slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The weight of what was coming, of the storm he had just invited onto his land, pressed down on his chest. They'll bring the law with them, he muttered, his mind already racing. Sarah looked at him, her eyes fierce and unwavering in the lantern light. Then we'll bring the truth. The lantern guttered for a moment, the flame dipping low, casting their elongated shadows dancing against the walls. Jake met her gaze, and in that instant, he felt something inside him shift, a lock that had been rusted shut for years, finally giving way. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if they could win. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would rather stand here with her and lose everything he owned than turn away and go back to living his small, empty life. He reached out and gently touched a strand of her fire-red hair. Stay with me, he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. Her hand covered his, her grip firm and steady. I already chose to. Outside, the barn doors rattled in a rising wind. Somewhere in the far distance, a low rumble of thunder growled a warning. But in that moment, in the small, warm circle of lantern light, two broken souls had just made a vow stronger than any contract, holier than any spoken word. Dawn was coming, and it was bringing a war with it. The silence that followed their departure was heavier than any sound. Jake knew that kind of quiet. It was the calm before the storm, the breath the prairie takes right before a twister tears it apart. Trouble was coming, and he could smell it on the wind. He took a seat with his back against the heavy barn door, as if he could hold the world at bay with his own body. He listened. The night sounds were different now, sharper, each one a potential threat. The hum of crickets, the mournful howl of a distant coyote, the soft, rhythmic sound of Sarah's breathing beside him in the hay. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. Sarah shifted, the straw rustling around her. Her voice was steady, a rock in the churning sea of his thoughts. You think they'll be back before morning? Jake rubbed a hand across his jaw, the stubble scratching like dried grass. Men like that don't make idle threats. They'll be back, and they'll have someone with a badge and a piece of paper, thinking that's enough to scare us into backing down. A piece of paper can't tell my story, Sarah said, a defiant edge to her voice. He turned to look at her, really look at her. The lantern flame traced the powerful lines of her shoulders, the proud set of her chin, and the raw, unvarnished truth that shone in her eyes. Then tell me, he said, his voice soft. "Tell me what that paper doesn't know." She hesitated for only a moment, then took a deep, steadying breath, and the story poured out of her. "I was promised," she began, her voice low but unwavering, "not to a man who loved me, or even knew me, but to a man who thought he could hide me. His family was ashamed of me, my size, my voice, my hunger to live a life that was bigger than the tiny, stifling rules they lived by. He paid a broker, the man in the coat, to take me west, to match me with some desperate man who wouldn't ask too many questions, someone who would just be grateful for a wife, any wife." Her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. "To them, I'm not a person. I'm a debt to be collected, a problem to be solved, a package to be delivered. They never once asked me what I wanted. They never for a second thought that I had the right to want anything at all." Jake listened, and every word was like a chisel, carving away at the man he used to be. He thought of the lonely graves on his land, of the mounting debts in his ledger book, of all the long, silent nights he had sat alone in his cabin, convincing himself that he wasn't meant for more than this. He understood, in a way he never had before, what it felt like to be treated like a burden. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, "you're not anyone's problem. Not here. Not while I'm still breathing." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she quickly looked away, as if she couldn't bear the weight of his sincerity, as if she didn't dare to believe it. Then, her voice dropped to a near whisper, a confession of her own. "Every man before you wanted me smaller." She looked back at him, her gaze piercing. "Tonight, I'm asking you not to." He reached out, his rough, calloused hand covering hers. The contrast was stark, his hand, scarred from work and fighting the land, and hers, large and strong, yet trembling slightly. "I don't want small," he said, his voice a raw promise. "I want real, even if it scares me half to death." A sound that was half sob, half laugh escaped her lips. She squeezed his hand, her grip so tight it was almost painful, but he welcomed it. The pain was a reminder that this was real, that he was alive. But before she could respond, a low, ominous vibration trembled through the ground. Hoofbeats again, but this time it was heavier, more than just two horses. And there was another sound, a rattling, creaking noise that made Jake's stomach sink like a stone. The sound of wagon wheels. A lantern light appeared in the distance, a bouncing, demonic firefly on the dark horizon. "They didn't wait for morning," Jake muttered, his blood running cold. Sarah surged to her feet, her magnificent frame filling the entire doorway of the barn, a warrior queen ready to defend her castle. "Let them come." The wagon rumbled into view, pulled by two heavy draft horses. Behind it rode three mounted men. One of them held a lantern high, and in its flickering glow, a sheriff's badge on his chest gleamed with cold authority. The man in the fine coat was perched on the wagon seat, a smug, triumphant look on his face, holding up his papers as if they were a holy scripture. The sheriff dismounted first. He was a broad-shouldered older man, with weary eyes that looked like they had seen too much trouble and had grown tired of caring. He methodically dusted off his coat, his movements slow and deliberate. He glanced at Jake, his expression unreadable. "Evening, Jake. We've got a matter of law to settle here." Jake stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Evening, Sheriff. Law or not, you know as well as I do that no person here belongs to you or anyone else." The man in the coat unfolded his papers with a dramatic flourish. "According to this legally binding contract she does, signed and sealed. A respectable gentleman back east paid for her passage, for her placement. This rancher has no legal claim." Sarah's voice cut through the tense air like a razor. "Then let your gentleman come here himself and say those words to my face. Let him look me in the eye and tell me that I'm a purchase, not a person." The sheriff frowned, a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "Now, miss, I don't make the laws. I just enforce them. Jake stepped closer, his own eyes blazing with a righteous fire. You enforce coin, Sheriff, not justice. Since when does this county value a piece of paper more than a human soul? The sheriff shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, but the man in the coat leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescending sweetness. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, rancher. Just hand her over, and no one gets hurt. Think about your debts, Jake. Think about that loan you have at the bank. One wrong move, and this whole place, everything your father built, will come crumbling down around you. It was a direct threat, a poisoned arrow aimed at Jake's deepest fear. He could feel Sarah's eyes on him, feel her waiting, wondering if this was it, if this was the moment he would finally break and run like all the others. He took a deep breath. I've been broke before, he said, his voice as steady and hard as the prairie rock. I'll be broke again if that's what it takes, but I will not sell my soul, and I sure as hell will not sell hers. The sheriff's hand instinctively drifted toward the pistol on his hip. The other riders tensed, their horses shifting restlessly. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Then Sarah stepped forward again, moving out from the shadows of the barn and into the full moonlight. Her shadow fell over all of them, a vast, imposing presence. She lifted her chin, and her voice rang out, clear and strong, carrying across the silent prairie. You can't take me, because I am not yours to take. And if you think that piece of paper gives you the right, then you'll have to read it out loud to the entire town. Let them all hear how men in fine coats trade women like cattle. Let's see if the good people of this county call that justice. The sheriff's eyes flickered, a crack in his armor of weary indifference. He looked from Sarah's defiant face to Jake's stony resolve, and then to the smug, sneering man on the wagon. The man in the coat saw the sheriff's hesitation and pounced on it. You think these people care about you? He sneered at Sarah. You think they'll side with the woman they all whisper about behind their hands? The woman they call a freak? No. They'll side with the man who pays their wages, who holds their debts. They'll side with order. Jake moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with Sarah, a united front against the darkness. His voice was low, but it carried an unshakable conviction. Maybe, or maybe they'll side with the truth. Either way, we're not stepping aside. For a long, heart-stopping moment, nobody moved. The night itself seemed to be holding its breath. The crickets fell silent. The wind died down. Then, the sheriff's hand dropped from his holster. He let out a long, weary sigh. We'll settle this in town, tomorrow. At the courthouse, let the judge hear both sides. He fixed the man in the coat with a hard stare. And until then, nobody touches her. Nobody comes back to this ranch. Is that understood? The smug smile on the coat's face finally faltered. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected resistance, not from a broken-down rancher and a woman the world had cast aside. Jake slowly exhaled, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. But it was mixed with a cold, creeping dread. They had won a reprieve, not a victory. Tomorrow, they would have to face the entire town, a day to prepare, a day to gather their strength, a day to make their stand. The sheriff signaled to his men, and the wagon turned, its wheels creaking in protest as it began the slow journey back to town. The dust rose behind them, glowing faintly in the moonlight like a trail of fading ghosts. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her broad shoulders trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. Jake reached out and gently touched her hand. You were brave, he said, his voice full of awe. Her eyes met his, a maelstrom of fierce pride and raw vulnerability. So were you, she whispered. But tomorrow, Jake, tomorrow, they will try to break us. He squeezed her hand tighter, his grip a silent promise. Then we won't let them. The night settled around them again, but the heavy weight of the coming dawn pressed down on both their chests. Tomorrow wasn't just about a trial in town. It was a test of everything they had dared to feel, everything they had chosen to become in the dusty, sacred space of that old barn. Morning arrived slow and heavy, like the deliberate beat of a drum before a march to battle. The sky over the plains was a bruised canvas of purple and gold. As Jake hitched his team to the wagon, the distant sound of the sheriff's party returning to town seemed to carry on the wind, a warning that the entire county was already awake and waiting. His hands, usually so steady, moved with a rough, restless energy over the leather straps. He didn't say much, but Sarah could see the storm brewing in his eyes. She stood beside him, her presence a quiet, solid anchor in the turbulent morning. "You don't have to do this, you know," Jake muttered, yanking a buckle tight. "You could be miles from here before they even open the courthouse doors." Sarah reached out and placed a hand on his arm, stopping his frantic movements. "Yes, I do," she said, her voice firm. "If I run now, I'll be running for the rest of my life. And I'm so tired of running." Her words pierced him to the core. He heard an echo of another voice, from long ago. His brother, his life bleeding out onto this same patch of dirt, whispering with his last breath, "Don't run, Jake. Stand." He had run that day, and the guilt had haunted him ever since. A fire lit in his soul, burning away the last vestiges of his fear. He turned to her, his gaze clear and resolved. "Then we stand together." When their wagon rolled into town, the streets were already lined with onlookers, farmers in dusty overalls, merchants peering from their shop doorways, wives clutching the hands of wide-eyed children, cowboys leaning against fence rails with crossed arms and judgmental stares. The whispers followed them like a swarm of insects. "That's her, the giant woman. She's a mountain, that one. No wonder no man will have her. Look at him. Poor fool's throwing his whole life away for her." Sarah heard every word, and each one felt like a small, sharp stone thrown against her ribs. But she didn't flinch. She kept her chin held high, her eyes fixed on the squat, whitewashed courthouse at the end of Main Street. Jake walked at her side, his presence a silent vow of solidarity. Inside, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with the heat of too many bodies, and the scent of sweat and anticipation. Benches creaked under the weight of neighbors who had come not for justice, but for a spectacle. The judge, a weary old man with a face like carved granite, adjusted his spectacles and peered down at the papers on his desk. The sheriff cleared his throat, his voice booming in the small space. "Case before the court. A claim of contractual rights to one Sarah Callahan, challenged by rancher Jacob Ward." The man in the fine coat stepped forward, his movements smooth and confident. His voice oozed a syrupy certainty. "Your Honor, the matter is quite plain. This woman was brought west under a legally binding agreement. Her transport, her lodging, her placement, all paid for in full by a respectable gentleman. These papers confirm it." He held the documents aloft, shaking them for all to see, like a set of chains. "This rancher has no legal standing, no right to interfere. By law and by contract, she belongs to another." A ripple of gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. The law was the law, after all. The judge turned his tired eyes to Sarah. "Miss Callahan, is this true? Did you travel here under such an arrangement?" Sarah felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, judging her, dissecting her. She took a deep breath, her chest rising. Her voice, when she spoke, was as firm and clear as a church bell. "I traveled, yes. But I am not a package to be delivered. I am not livestock to be traded. I am a woman. Those papers may be covered in ink, Your Honor, but they do not carry my consent." The crowd shifted restlessly. A few people frowned. Some whispered to their neighbors. A few heads nodded in slow agreement. The man in the coat sneered. "Consent? She ate the bread paid for by my client. She rode in the wagon he provided. She is wearing the clothes he bought for her. In this territory, that is payment enough. That is consent." Sarah's hand, hidden in the folds of her skirt, began to shake, but her voice cut through his oily words like a scythe. "I would rather starve in freedom than feast in chains." For the first time, a flicker of interest sparked in the judge's dull eyes. He leaned forward, peering over his glasses at her. Then he turned his gaze to Jake. "And you, Mr. Ward? What is your place in all of this? This isn't your fight." Jake stepped forward, clutching his dusty hat in his hands. His voice was rough, unpolished, but it rang with an undeniable sincerity. "It became my fight the moment she asked me not to run. It became my fight because every man who ever walked away from her made her believe that she was too much to be loved. And I will not add my name to that list." He looked around at the faces in the crowd, at the sheriff, at the judge. "If you want to call me a fool for that, then go right ahead. But don't you dare tell me that a piece of paper means more than the living, breathing truth standing right beside me." A profound hush fell over the courtroom. Even the motes of dust dancing in the sunbeams seemed to pause. The man in the coat, seeing his advantage slipping away, slammed the papers down on the judge's desk. "The law is not about feelings," he snarled. "It is about order. If men cannot trust the sanctity of a contract, this entire territory will crumble into chaos." Sarah stepped forward again, her voice as steady as steel. "If men can't trust the sanctity of a human heart, then this whole world is already lost." The judge studied her, then Jake, then the smug man clutching his precious contracts. He rubbed his long, wrinkled chin, his expression troubled. "This is not a simple matter," he muttered, clearly torn. From the very back of the room, a weathered old man slowly rose to his feet. It was Eli, the Creekside trapper, a man who had lived in these parts longer than the law itself. His voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of the room. "Judge," he said, his words slow and deliberate, "you and I both know this territory was built by folks who stood up when the world told them to bow down. If we start letting men in fine coats trade women on paper, well, then we're no better than the tyrants we all came west to escape." A new wave of murmurs rose from the benches, sharper this time, more thoughtful. A woman near the front clutched her young daughter a little tighter. A young ranch hand whispered to his friend, "The old man's right." The man in the coat's face turned a blotchy red. "This is nonsense," he sputtered. "If this court sides with a woman's whims over a legal document, then every contract in this county is worthless." Jake faced him squarely, his eyes hard. "Not worthless, just no longer an excuse for cruelty." The judge banged his gavel once, the sharp crack echoing off the wooden walls. "Enough!" His gaze fell on Sarah, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Jake saw something like compassion in the old man's eyes. "This court will recess until I have made my decision." He looked directly at the man in the coat. "And in the meantime, Miss Callahan will not be removed from this town. She will remain under the protection of this court." The words were small, but they landed with the force of a cannonball. The man in the coat's jaw dropped. The crowd erupted into a cacophony of chatter. Some people cheered openly, others cursed under their breath. But something had shifted. The tide was turning. The man in the coat snatched his papers off the desk and stormed out of the courtroom, his boots striking the wooden floor like angry hammer blows. Sarah's knees nearly gave out from under her. Jake was there in an instant, his arm steadying her. "It's not over," he whispered in her ear. "I know," she breathed, her voice trembling but her eyes glowing with a fire he'd never seen before. "But it's the first time in my entire life that anyone has ever told me I could stay." They walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. Some people stared with a newfound awe, others with a lingering disdain, but Sarah no longer dropped her gaze. She walked with her head held high, as if every step was a declaration of her own worth. As Jake helped her up into the wagon, he leaned in close. "Whatever happens next," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I'm glad you dared me." Sarah looked at him, tears welling in her eyes, but her smile was fierce and beautiful. "And I'm glad you stayed." The wheels creaked as the horses pulled them away from the town, away from the prying eyes and the whispers. Ahead of them stretched a long, uncertain road, but for the first time in either of their lives, they were not walking it alone. And somewhere in the distance the thunder rolled again, a dark and ominous promise that the storm was far from over. That night the sky ripped open. Rain hammered the land in driving, horizontal sheets, drumming on the tin roof of Jake's barn until it roared like 1,000 marching soldiers. Lightning tore across the horizon, jagged white scars splitting the oppressive darkness. Inside, huddled against the storm, Jake and Sarah's voices were nearly swallowed by the gale. He lit another lantern, its flame shivering in the wet gusts of wind that forced their way through the cracks in the walls. His jaw was tight, his shoulders squared, as if he were bracing for a physical blow. "They'll be back," Sarah said, her voice remarkably steady, even as the wind howled and rattled the very foundations of the barn. "I know," Jake answered. He was trying to busy his restless hands, pouring water for the horses, but his movements were jerky, agitated. "A man like that doesn't accept defeat. He'll find another way. A darker way." Sarah moved closer to him. Her hair was damp from the rain that seeped through the roof, and in the flickering lantern light, she looked larger than life, her shadow stretching behind her like a giant from some ancient legend. But her voice was soft, intimate. "Then let's be ready for him." Jake looked at her, and for the first time, he saw past her size, past the wall of defiance she showed the world, and saw the unshakable strength of her heart. She wasn't asking him to fight for her anymore. She was asking to fight with her. He gave a single, determined nod. "We will." The storm raged all through the night. They took turns keeping watch, listening for the telltale sound of hoofbeats beneath the crashing thunder. By dawn, the rain had finally subsided to a drizzle, but a thick, clinging mud covered everything, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and impending doom. As soon as there was enough light to see, Jake saddled his horse. Sarah stood at the barn door, watching him, a worried frown on her face. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To Eli's place," he said, cinching the saddle tight. "The old man knows the law, but he also knows the people. He knows the secrets this town keeps. If they bring trouble, I want him on our side before it gets here." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Be careful, Jake." He swung himself up into the saddle, paused, and gave her a long, meaningful look that said more than words ever could. Then he spurred his horse and disappeared into the gray, misty morning. The hours crawled by. Sarah tried to keep herself busy, mending tack, feeding the animals, doing anything to push away the gnawing fear that was chewing at the edges of her composure. Every creak of the old barn's wood, every caw of a distant crow, made her heart leap into her throat. By midday, her fear became a reality. A wagon, its wheels struggling in the deep mud, rolled up the track to the barn. It was followed by 3 riders. She didn't see a sheriff's badge this time. Just the man in the fine coat, his face set in a smug, determined mask, and 2 hired men whose eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. They weren't here to talk about the law. They were here to take what they believed was theirs. Sarah's heart thundered against her ribs, but she stood her ground, tall and unbending, as they pulled to a stop. The man in the coat's smile was thin and sharp as a razor's edge. "Miss Callahan," he called out, his voice dripping with false politeness. "It seems the judge is taking too long to decide on a simple matter. So, I've come to settle it myself." "You'll find nothing simple here," Sarah called back, her voice carrying clearly over the damp ground. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Everything is simple when Coin decides the outcome. Now step into the wagon. There's no need to make this any harder than it has to be." I don't belong to you, Sarah said, her voice firm, each word a stone. Not yesterday, not today, not ever. His eyes darkened. With a flick of his hand, one of the riders dismounted and started moving toward her, his intentions clear. Sarah's body tensed, her hands curling into fists at her sides. For her entire life, she had been afraid of her own size, of her own strength. She had spent years trying to hide it, to make herself smaller. Not anymore. Today, she would use it. The rider reached out to grab her arm, but Sarah took a powerful step back, her voice ringing out like a clap of thunder. Touch me, and you will regret it for the rest of your short life. The man hesitated, just for a second. But a second was all they needed. Hoofbeats, fast and furious, thundered down the road. Jake burst into the clearing, Eli riding hard right beside him, an old, well-oiled rifle strapped across his saddle. Jake's eyes were blazing with a righteous fury as he swung down from his horse, mud splattering from his boots. "Step away from her," he barked, his voice a command that could not be ignored. The hired man froze in his tracks. The man in the coat lifted his chin defiantly. "You have no authority here, Ward. This is a private matter." Eli dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, the way of a man who has lived long enough to know that you never rush when death is in the air. He unslung his rifle and leaned on it casually, as if it were a walking stick. "Funny," he drawled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I was always taught that when a woman says no, the matter's settled. But maybe that's just old-fashioned thinking." The smugness on the coat's face finally began to crumble. His eyes darted between Jake's furious expression, Eli's calm demeanor with the rifle, and Sarah's towering, immovable form. He was a man who understood odds, and the odds had just shifted dramatically against him. Jake took another step forward, his voice low but sharp as broken glass. "You came here with hired guns to take her by force. That's not law, that's theft, and you're doing it on my land." The man in the coat sneered, but there was a tremor of fear in his voice now. "You think the town will side with you? With her? They laugh at her, Ward. They whisper about her. They call her unnatural." Before Jake could even respond, Sarah's voice rose, powerful and clear, silencing them all. "Let them laugh. Let them whisper. I am done folding myself into smaller pieces to fit into their smallness. If being too much for them means I finally get to be myself, then so be it." Her words cracked through the air like a bolt of lightning. The riders shifted uneasily in their saddles, their bravado evaporating. Jake's chest swelled with a fierce, unshakable pride. He moved to stand fully at Sarah's side, their shoulders touching, their shadows merging into one single defiant shape. "If you come for her," he said, his voice deadly calm, "you come through me." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft drip of rainwater from the eaves of the barn. The man in the coat's face was a twisted mask of rage and frustration, but his riders hesitated, unwilling to be the first to move against a man who stood with that kind of unyielding certainty. Eli lifted his rifle just an inch. "Best ride on out of here while you still can." The man in the coat's mouth curled in a final, impotent snarl of disgust. He spat into the mud, then yanked on the reins of his horse so hard the animal whinnied in protest. "This isn't over. The law will crush you both." He turned his wagon sharply, its wheels churning up mud, and his riders followed close behind. As they disappeared over the hill, Sarah's legs finally began to tremble. Jake caught her arm, holding her steady. "They'll be back," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I know," Jake said, his grip on her arm gentle but firm. His voice softened. "But so will we." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't try to hide them this time. "Why are you doing this, Jake? You could lose everything. You could walk away and save yourself." He looked at her, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his eyes burning with a truth so pure it took her breath away. "Because I have already lost too much in my life, by walking away from the things that mattered. I will not lose this. I will not lose you. Her tears fell then, but a smile broke through them, as bright and hopeful as the sun breaking through the storm clouds. For the first time, she truly believed him. For the first time, she truly believed in herself. The storm had passed, but the war was far from over. Tomorrow, the town and the law would have their final say. But tonight, standing together under the wet gray sky, Jake and Sarah were unbroken. Their love was no longer a question or a dare. It was a vow. Dawn rose clean and sharp after the storm. The sky was rinsed to a brave, cloudless blue that made the whole town look as if it had been washed clean and forgiven. But forgiveness wasn't something that was handed out in a courthouse. It had to be fought for, tooth and nail. Before they left the ranch, Jake did something strange. He took a thin strip of red cloth, a ribbon he'd kept from his mother, and tied it securely around his own wrist. Then he pressed a small, smooth stone, a luck piece that had belonged to his brother, into Sarah's palm. For courage, he said. For truth, she answered, closing her fist around the stone. The wagon wheels thumped over the same muddy boards as the day before, but today they didn't sound like a retreat. They sounded like a drumline, marching them toward their destiny. The town was already gathered, a silent, waiting jury. Storekeepers stood in their doorways, their aprons still dusted with flour. Ranch hands, their boots caked with dried mud, watched from the sidelines. Mothers held their children close, their eyes hard and uncertain. The sheriff stood on the courthouse steps, his hat in his hands, looking not proud, not ashamed, but simply ready. The man in the fine coat was there too, waiting by the door. He had 2 new, tougher-looking riders with him today, and his face was scrubbed clean of yesterday's fear, replaced with a cold, practiced confidence. When he saw Sarah step down from the wagon, his lips curled into a thin, condescending smile. "Last chance to do this the quiet way," he said, his voice low enough for only them to hear. "Step aside. Let the law be the law." Sarah looked at him, not with fear or anger, but with a kind of weary pity. "If your law needs me to be small to work," she said, her voice clear and steady, "then it isn't law. It's just fear wearing a paper mask." Inside, the courtroom was jammed tight, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and nervous sweat. The judge took his seat, his face as grim and unreadable as ever. His gavel didn't need to strike twice to command silence. Every person in that room was leaning forward, holding their breath. The man in the coat laid his papers on the table like a winning hand of cards. "Your Honor," he began, his voice as smooth as syrup. "The court has had a night to consider. I trust that reason has returned. The woman's passage, her clothing, her placement, all paid for. The gentleman's claim is clear. Return the property and let this good town get back to its business." The word property landed like a slap in the face. A baby at the back of the room started to cry, and his mother hushed him with a trembling hand. The sheriff's jaw ticked. But then a figure moved from the back of the room. It was Eli. He had his hat under his arm, and in his other hand he held a folded packet of papers as carefully as if it were a newborn child. He caught the judge's eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Eli, you have something to add?" Eli stepped forward and laid the packet on the judge's desk. "Affidavit, Judge," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Letters and a sworn witness statement from a woman back in Boston. A woman who tore up the very same kind of contract after this man." He pointed a gnarled finger at the man in the coat. "Tried to move her west like a sack of grain. I rode all night to fetch it from the stage stop. She may have left town last month, but she left her words behind." He leaned closer to the judge's bench. "And her words say that consent can't be bought with train tickets and new dresses. Her words say that the gentleman behind these papers isn't a prospective husband at all. He's a collector. He runs a traveling show of curiosities." A sound rolled through the benches, a low growl of anger and disgust. The man in the coat's face went pale. "Lies!" he snapped, his voice suddenly shrill. "The woman was bitter. She's a scorned. These papers are legal." "Then let's read them out loud." It was Sarah who spoke. It wasn't a question. It was a command. She walked to the table with a calm that wasn't quiet. It was the deep, rumbling calm of distant thunder. The judge, after a moment's hesitation, handed her the papers. She read them aloud, her voice steady and strong. The names, the dates, the cold, clinical sums of money. With every line she read, the man in the coat seemed to shrink a little smaller. When she finished, the room didn't cheer. It did something more powerful. It understood. The judge folded his hands and leaned forward. "Mr. Hollis," he said, addressing the man in the coat by name for the first time. "You have appeared in my court before, always with your tidy stacks of paper and your tidy smiles. Today your papers claim that a gentleman owns a woman's future because he purchased her path. This court recognizes debts of coin, Mr. Hollis. It does not, and will not, recognize debts taken from a person's dignity." He fixed the man with a stare as hard as iron. "I ask you now, and I will only ask this once. Produce this gentleman. If he wishes to lay claim to a living, breathing human soul, let him stand here in the light and do it himself." Hollis's mouth worked, but no sound came out. He tried for a casual shrug, but it looked more like a spasm. He ain't here." "Is he even real?" the judge pressed. Hollis's eyes darted to the floor. "He pays," he muttered. "And there it is," Eli said from the side. "Coin without a face, a chain without a blacksmith." The judge leaned back in his chair, and his voice softened, which somehow made it even stronger. This territory was carved out of the wilderness by people who said no to chains. If we allow paper to be used as a rope, we disgrace the very graves that hold this town up. He turned his gaze to Sarah. "Miss Callahan, do you wish to remain in this town of your own free will?" Sarah felt the smooth, cool luck piece, hot now from her own fist, pressed into her palm. She looked at Jake. She saw the red ribbon on his wrist, a splash of color against his sun-beaten skin. She saw the fear in his eyes that he was no longer trying to hide, and the courage that he refused to let go of. She saw his eyes saying, "I'm staying right here, whether you say yes or no." Then she looked out at the faces in the crowd, the people who had called her names with their eyes, and she saw something new there. A few heads dipped in apology. A few hands were placed over hearts. "I wish to stay in a place where the truth is heavier than paper," she said, her voice ringing with emotion. "If that place is here, then I will stay." "And with whom do you wish to stay?" the judge asked gently. Sarah didn't rush her answer. She turned slowly to face Jake. He didn't move. He didn't try to fill the silence. He let her claim it, let her make it her own. "With the man who didn't run," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I wish to stay with Jacob Ward, if he'll have me. Not as a trophy he won in a fight, but as a partner, for all the long, ordinary days when there is no crowd to impress." The breath left Jake's body in a rush, as if he'd just set down a boulder he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying since he was a boy. He stepped forward, his voice rough with unshed tears. "I will have you, Sarah Callahan, not to own you, but to honor you, to learn from you, to laugh with you, to build fences beside you and watch the storms blow past while we hold the door shut, together." A laugh burst from someone in the crowd, a sob from someone else. Hollis slammed his palm flat on the table. "Sentiment!" he spat, his face twisted with rage. "This is sentiment dressed up as law." "No," a calm, certain voice said. It was the sheriff. He took 2 deliberate steps forward, placed his hand on Hollis's stack of papers, and slid them off the table. "This is the law finally dressing up as the truth it should have been all along." He looked directly at Hollis. "You're under arrest, for fraud, and for attempted abduction." He nodded to the two hard-faced riders who had flanked Hollis. They didn't move a muscle to help him. Their eyes were suddenly very interested in the floorboards. The sheriff produced a pair of iron cuffs and, with the practiced ease of a man who had been waiting a long time to do this, clicked them shut around the wrists that had signed away so many quiet hopes and dreams. As they led Hollis away, he twisted his head to spit one last venomous curse at Sarah. "They'll still laugh at you," he hissed. "You'll never be small enough for them." Sarah lifted her chin, her eyes clear and bright. "Good," she said softly. "I'm done trying." The courtroom door swung shut behind him, and a collective sigh of relief seemed to sweep through the room. The judge banged his gavel one last time, not to silence anyone, but to mark the moment, to drive it home like a nail into a solid piece of wood. "This court recognizes the personhood and the freedom of Sarah Callahan," he declared, his voice booming. "No piece of paper will ever say otherwise in my town. The only ledgers we keep from now on will be of vows, not sales." He looked from Jake to Sarah, and for just a heartbeat, the old granite face broke into a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Court is adjourned." They stepped out of the courthouse and into the sunlight, and it felt like they were stepping into a different world. The crowd parted for them, and then, hesitantly at first, began to close in around them, but not to gawk, to speak. The storekeeper, his sleeves still dusted with flour, tugged his cap and mumbled that he was sorry for the way his eyes had been small. A young ranch hand who had laughed the loudest the day before came forward, holding out a fence post he'd planned smooth. "For your south pasture," he mumbled, his face red. A little girl, no older than 5, slipped away from her mother, ran up to Sarah, and handed her a slightly crushed wildflower. "You're pretty," the girl said with the blunt, perfect honesty of a child. "Like a mountain." "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice thick because she was suddenly remembering how to accept a gift without feeling the need to shrink to fit inside it. They climbed back into the wagon. The town was the same dusty street, same weathered storefronts, but it felt wider, as if some invisible wall had been pushed back, letting in more sky. Jake flicked the reins, and the horses, sensing the change, leaned into their harnesses, eager for home. They rode in a comfortable silence for a while, the road humming under the wheels. A hawk circled high above them, drawing long, easy lines against the brilliant blue sky. When they reached the ridge overlooking the ranch, the spot where you could see the 2 lonely graves on the hill and the long green stretch of pasture beyond, Jake pulled the team to a stop. The wind combed through Sarah's hair and lifted the red ribbon on Jake's wrist like a tiny, triumphant banner. He turned to her, his hands resting on his knees, no longer shaking. "I don't have any fancy words, Sarah," he said, his voice plain and honest. "I talk like dirt and rain and fence wire. But what I have, I'll give you. And what I don't have yet, I'll learn. If you'll stay." "I'm not staying," she said. And for a terrifying second, his heart stuttered. Then she smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that lit up her whole face. "I'm building with you. That's different." He laughed then. A real, honest, ugly laugh that comes from deep in a man's chest when he finally realizes the ground beneath his feet is solid. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the smooth luck piece. At the exact same moment, she reached into her pocket. They traded without a word. She took back the coin, and he retied the red ribbon, snug and secure, around her wrist this time. "We keep both," he said, "to remind us." "Remind us of what?" she asked. "That we were scared," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "and we did it anyway." They reached the barn as the afternoon light slanted gold across the fields. The boards still creaked, the lantern still hung from its hook, but everything felt new, reborn. As Jake unhitched the team, Sarah stepped inside the barn and ran her palm along the rough wood of a stall door. A simple touch, but it was a declaration. This is mine. Not because someone bought it for me, but because I belong here. He joined her, and for a long time, they just stood there, side by side, listening to the wind whispering through the cracks. It sounded like music. Later, as evening began to settle, something amazing happened. Neighbors started to arrive, not with speeches or congratulations, but with casseroles and shovels and extra hands. Someone fixed the sagging gate at the end of the drive. Someone else helped set a corner post that had been leaning all summer. The baker's wife left a fresh loaf of bread on the porch and was gone before they could even say thank you. Sarah looked at Jake, her eyes shining. They're different. No, he answered softly. We are, and that's making room for them to be. That night, they lit the lantern and sat in the straw, right in the same spot where the first dare had been spoken. Sarah took Jake's calloused hands in her own. Tell me again, she whispered. Tell me what you're choosing. He swallowed, the words coming easy now, no longer a struggle, but a simple truth. I'm choosing the long way. I'm choosing the kind of love that makes room. I'm choosing to stand when the wind tells me to bend. He looked her directly in the eye. I'm choosing you. Her eyes shone with a light so bright it could have outshone the lantern. Then I'm choosing to be seen. All of me. She smiled, a big, fearless, unashamed smile. Try it if you can. He smiled back, the kind of smile that starts deep in a man's soul and spreads to every part of him. I will. They didn't kiss in a rush, like they were trying to get to the end of something. They simply rested their foreheads together, a silent promise at the beginning of everything. Outside, the prairie gathered its quiet darkness, and inside, in the warm golden light, two lives began to share the same roof of courage. If this story moved you, join our family. Hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss the next tale.